In a world where the smartphone camera is more competitive than ever, how does Samsung's newest offerings compare to their best just 2 short years ago? Now before we get started, let's just get a few important details out of the way. All photos taken in this test are with Scene Optimizer off, as I found it led to overprocessing and incorrect subject detection. Also, both phones are on the Snapdragon CPU variety, and their latest respective softwares. Now, let's get into the specs. Looking at the specs quickly, you'll see that the S21 sports a telephoto zoom lens over the S10e. The main sensors are fairly similar between the two, with the only difference being slightly larger sensors on the S21. And as for the wide angle, the S10e has a slightly higher megapixel count at 16 megapixels versus the 12 megapixels of the S21. The S10e's ultra-wide also has a 3-degree wider field of view at 123 degrees versus the S21's 120 degrees. Moving over to the samples, we'll be looking at several different aspects: daylight, HDR, low light, zoom, and ultra-wide. Daylight. In this photo of a pine cone, the S10e opted to go for a less warm photo as well as less saturated colors, which is more true to life, but that means the S21's photo does look a little bit more intriguing to the eye. Additionally, the S10e seems to have overexposed the photo slightly, resulting in lost detail in the petals of the pine cone. The S21's larger sensor size came into play here, resulting in more natural background blur, which is useful for blocking out messy and cluttered backgrounds. Looking at this photo of a log next to the water, the S10e once again overexposed just slightly, making it lose more detail in the lighter parts of the log. Also, the S21 decided to go for a more saturated and warm color temperature, while the S10e went for a more muted and true-to-life look once again. Moving to some indoor daylight photos, this cat statue in my room shows the S21's capability of capturing more detail in photos, especially in indoor situations. In these two photos, it's visible that the cat photo from the S21 has more detail in the face and more contrast in the contouring of the body. This is quite a challenging photo, as the cat is just one color, meaning that the phones are relying on HDR and processing more so than actual camera sensors. The S21 went for a warmer color temperature this time around again, but it's not as drastic as the last two photos. Also, the S10e seems to be more saturated this time around, unlike last time when it was the least saturated one. So this must have something to do with it being indoors. Looking at the two photos, it's visible that the S21 and the S10e both exposed the photos just right, with the S10e being a tad bit darker, but neither being overexposed like the S10e was outdoors. HDR. Looking at this photo of a leaf on a tree, it is quite visible that both photos handled this situation incredibly well, with the sun behind the leaf being almost too bright to look at in person. Both phones kept the sky in the background perfectly exposed and with tons of detail. The S21's larger sensor once again has more natural background blur, blocking out the shed in the background. When looking closer, it is visible that the S10e did maintain a tad bit more detail in the leaves, while the S21 lost a slightly bit more detail in the sky behind the leaf and in the leaf. But both are actually quite impressive with how challenging the situation this was. An additional note is that both of these photos were taken at the same distance from the leaf, but the S21's main sensor is slightly more zoomed in naturally than the S10e, with the S10e having a slightly wider main lens. In this next challenging situation, this is an indoor plant with a bright outdoor window behind it. Taking a closer look at the background, both photos preserved quite a bit of detail in these wispy bright clouds. This is a very challenging photo, as the sun is directly behind the plants and is quite a lot brighter than it is in the room. Both photos maintained a lot of detail in the veins of the leaves and maintained an accurate green color, pretty much similar on both. The S10e opted for a warmer hue, while the S21 opted for a more purple hue, which is quite weird. Once again here, the S21 has more of a natural background blur due to its larger sensor size. Low light. In this photo of a bird, I decide to leave night mode off, just to see how well both phones can perform in a very dark room with no special features. The S10e looks like it preserved just a tad bit more detail in the bird, and the S21 achieved a slight bit more background blur. The saturation and color temperature of both photos is the closest it's been throughout this entire comparison, with colors and everything just being almost the same. It is worth noting that this room was extremely dark, and the bird was barely visible to the naked eye, so both of these photos alone are extremely impressive. In this next photo, night mode was turned on both phones. Both phones decided to expose for 5 seconds. The S21's photo is drastically better than it was without night mode on, with more accurate colors, a brighter image, and a lot more detail, which is a huge step up from the last photo, which was dark and lacking detail. The S10e's photo seemed to have gotten a little bit grainier, and colors had gotten a little bit less saturated. This might be a one-time error, but I did take the photos multiple times to see if it was an error, and it was not. It seems as though the S10e's capabilities in processing low-light photos is not as robust as the S21. Also, the S21's larger sensor size does allow it to naturally collect more light than the S10e. Moving outdoors, both phones had night mode on, and exposed for 5 seconds. Once again, the S21 was able to gather more detail, less grain, and more accurate colors, with the S10e just adding some weird colors to the sky. Granted, both of these photos were extremely dark and barely visible to the naked eye, so both of these photos are more than anyone can see in real life. Although the S21 is just quite impressive, and the S10e's sensor size and hardware is just showing its age, as the sensors are not as large and are not able to capture as much light as the S21. Zoom. Both of these photos were taken at 3x zoom. The S21's telephoto lens is naturally at 3x zoom, meaning it does not have to use any digital zoom to zoom into 3x, meaning it loses no quality. While the S10e does not have a zoom lens, so it has to use digital zoom to zoom into this 3x, meaning it lost quite a bit of detail in the meanwhile. Taking a closer look, the S10e's photo is just not as sharp and has lost a lot of saturation, which is usually the cause of digital zoom, which is basically cropping into a photo. The S21's natural 3x telephoto zoom lens was able to get more detail and natural colors due to it not having to use a digital zoom. Both of these photos were taken at 8x zoom. The reason behind this is because the S10e's zoom capabilities max out at 8 times, while the S21 maxes out at 30 times. So, the S21 is only less than half of its zoom capabilities here, while the S10e is maxed out. Taking a closer look, the S21 has maintained vastly more detail, accurate colors, and just overall, the S10e's photo looks a little muddy. But that is to be expected with the lack of a telephoto lens. And just for fun, here's what the S21 looks like when maxing out at 30 times zoom. You can see that the S10e is once again stuck at 8x, while the S21 was able to zoom past into the 30x area. Once both phones are maxed out at 30x and 8x respectively, both photos are starting to become slightly unusable, and quite frankly have lost a lot of detail, accuracy, and overall just not the most pleasant photos. Ultra-wide. Of this photo of a tree on the ultra-wide lens of both phones, this is the closest that both phones have been this entire video. Both the saturation, color temperature, sharpness, background blur, and everything are nearly identical, with the only difference being the S10e's slightly wider 123 degrees of field of view versus the S21's 120 degrees field of view. Both maintained a great amount of detail and had minimal warping on the edge of the photo. It is visible that the S21 had slightly less over-sharpened, as the S10e did over-sharpen the branches in the upper part of the tree just a little bit, but both are quite impressive, especially with lack of stretching on the corners of the photos, which is quite frequent with wide-angle lenses. In this photo of a field, the differences are a little bit more noticeable, with the S21 adding more saturation and a warmer hue like it did earlier in the test. The S21 did do a better job at HDR around the sun, and keeping more detail and less feathering. Of this photo of an indoor room, it shows that both cameras were capable of capturing an entire room from one corner, which is quite nice. This photo also shows just how similar the wide-angle lenses are once again, with the only difference being a slightly warmer color temperature on the S21, as well as slightly more detail in the threads of the chair on the S21. But overall, the photos of both of these wide-angle lenses are just so similar. In conclusion, both phones' cameras are incredibly reliable in a large majority of scenarios, and neither will leave you wanting more. The S21 gains an edge over the S10e in the zoom and low light categories, with its extra telephoto lens and all-around larger sensors, while the S10e gains an edge in color accuracy. While the S10e is able to hold its own 2 years later, there is no denying that the S21 is more well-rounded, performing exceptionally well in all categories, thus taking the edge in this comparison.